hello, Troubled Maker.
I was actually thinking that my name kind of sounds like a rap name, kind of. Like if somebody just calls me Trouble. Because I don't want to be one of the ones that's like Lil Trouble that have the tattoos that look like somebody drew on their face when they were drunk. And so yeah, here I am. Like, when did that become a look?
So, you know a lot about cults.
Yep.
And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, but this is your first appearance on this show.
Mm-hmm.
So would you just like to introduce yourself and talk to us a little bit about how you ended up playing Elden Ring?
Well, I was stuck in bed and couldn't do much else. And then I was also thinking, I was like, I don't want to be involved. What can I get good at? Oh, 3,000 hours later. Not because I'm all just playing it, because I also intentionally broke the game and put it back together to make it look prettier.
Yeah, so you actually have a channel of your own that you have all of your free cam mod footage on, if anyone sort of is curious about that.
Yeah, maybe that
Maybe.
might exist. Yeah. Oh, because there's stuff I kind of noticed, and I was like, oh, that's that's a lamprey. That's kind of what I find to be the because there's been like a smattering of other people that I think have gotten into this that wouldn't otherwise for whatever reason, and they have different backgrounds that would have insight into things, or they're from a different part of the world, and so they would see something and notice something that maybe others wouldn't. So you are actually really into lore stuff, I heard.
Apparently, yeah.
Yeah, apparently.
I'm trying to get away from it.
Yeah, you probably should keep doing it. At least until we're done.
So, as you mentioned, everyone sort of brings their own interests and their own experiences to their engagement, and something that you know a lot about, because it's a subject of interest to you, and you've done a lot of research and reading on it, is how cults work. We got to talking about that, and that led us to discuss, how that sort of dovetails into the DLC with Miquella having these really devoted followers, and how kind of the cult of Miquella is in its own way different from, say, like the worship of Marika, or what someone like Moog is doing. Like there's something specific kind of about what's going on with Miquella.
Yeah. Because a religion is different than a cult.
Kind of my jumping off point was that, I don't know as much about this as you do. My very limited understanding of the situation is basically that, the key difference between what makes something a religion and what makes something a cult is that a religion is venerating, some sort of deity that is not of this earth. They are following, a specific code or something like that. Whereas a cult is about the will of, a single person, a single individual that is being venerated.
Not necessarily.
Right.
When certain religions kind of become culty, I guess you could say, the term for that is usually high demand group. Very strict forms of Christianity, really, but it ends up being very small. It's not something that's particularly common, and that can occur. And I typically usually would just by default refer to them as high demand groups because you don't want to get in the habit of calling things cults or even culty because of that being kind of a loaded word. Also, at the same time, losing its meaning entirely. But the core part of it is that your environment's controlled and you don't have a sense of agency. There's more to it than that, of course, but there's it's a massive element of control. And often there's the use of coercion, whether it be coercive control or coercive persuasion. The thing with whenever you look into or whenever you're aware of that sort of practice and manipulation, the thing is that what's more common than that is the elements behind it that often facilitate and help like run a cult. So things like propaganda, trying to intentionally deceive, indoctrination, like those particular core elements typically will show up and are able to be identified a lot easier, especially in places in media and especially online.
So within Elden Ring, what would you say is like the unique property of the Miquella followers that is kind of making that more cultish than, say, like the people who worship Marika?
We'd start with the bewitching branch. That immediate, basically, whenever I saw that, I'm just kind of like, oh, okay, that's essentially set up like either thought reform or like completely indoctrinating somebody because
Right.
you've essentially taken away their agency and their free will.
Right.
And then there are things that were said as the for the trailers and the DLC. Remind me of kind of how Miquella is introduced like initially in the game, because it's been a while since I very first played it and was introduced to everything. It was probably 2.5 years ago. So
So Miquella's technically introduced like in the intro.
You're right.
To the game, but it's just like a static picture of him being kidnapped by Moog.
Mm-hmm.
So throughout the game, Miquella is a character that like you keep hearing about, and he is described in these like incredibly sort of potent terms. Like he is like the most fearsome of, the Empyreans.
Right.
The way he is presented is he's the twin of Melania. When they are born, there is a curse that is placed upon them. So, Melania's afflicted by the rot, and Miquella's afflicted by being essentially a child for eternity. You never actually get a really good look at him. You see depictions of him, and you see his hand, and you see like sort of like ghostly visions of him, but he looks like he's about 8 or 9 years old. So even though Miquella is sort of forever a child, he is also depicted as incredibly intelligent and possessing this incredible degree of just like raw power. He uses that to try and cure Melania of the Scarlet Rot. And in the process of doing that, he realizes that Marika's Golden Order, Marika's entire religion, is insufficient. It's not up to the task of what Miquella wants to do. So Miquella leaves. And he essentially starts his own, we're going to say religion for now, but we're going to call it a cult later on.
Okay.
Much like Marika, he ends up sealing himself inside of a gigantic holy tree. Which becomes this beacon, and it specifically becomes a beacon for the people that Marika has kicked out. The people that Marika has sort of made other. As you travel to Miquella's holy tree, you find out that, like, the other people who are treading the same path as you are, like, the Albinorics.
Both versions.
The misbegotten, people who've got the Scarlet Rot. It's this hodgepodge of people who are not blessed by the Erd Tree, essentially. They're all on this big pilgrimage to Miquella because they view Miquella as this savior. Along with that, Miquella also has this alternate self called St. Trina.
Yeah.
St. Trina is, in a lot of ways, like, the opposite of Miquella.
You really think of them as opposites? Like, completely?
Well, I think of them as, like, not so much complete opposites, but as, like, things that are in tension with each other.
Yeah.
He's simultaneously, like, he's a boy and he's a girl. He's a child and he's an adult. He's awake and he's asleep.
Yeah, because there's kind of the drawing the parallel between, Radagon, Marika. How are they one? How does that work? When did they split off? How do they do that?
I always found that interesting because, like, the way that the Marika Radagon thing is kind of described to you, it's like Radagon and Marika are two distinct things, and Marika kind of invites Radagon to become one with her. Whereas Miquella and St. Trina, they were always in that contradiction. Whereas Marika kind of invites it into herself. And, like, the other thing that I always found really interesting about the Miquella St. Trina thing is that, like, Miquella's curse is to be forever a child. But St. Trina's not a child.
Right.
So it's always also seemed to me like, oh, St. Trina is sort of like when Miquella grows out somehow of being a child, they will become something like St. Trina.
Does it say at some point, like, refer to St. Trina in some way as Miquella's fate?
What happens is in the trailer that you hear later narrate and say, like,
even his fate.
And it shows St. Trina going down the fissure. But, like, even before that, like, I always, like, kind of saw her that way. Then the DLC happened. And that didn't happen.
Right.
Right. Something that we talked about just then was, like, Marika has created a world where there are a lot of people who are dispossessed. Who do not have places to go, who are cast out of society, who, like, feel like there is no hope, but then they see Miquella. And Miquella represents, like, somewhere that they can go. So, do you want to talk about how that, like, kind of plays into this very cultish idea with Miquella?
Whenever a person is in a situation or in a predicament where they are incredibly vulnerable and they are looking for something and they're desperate, not that Miquella particularly does this bit, but usually if there is kind of like a cult leader, essentially they promise them that thing and that they are the only ones that can provide it and that they have the answer and that they're right. There's a term called the sacred science. And it's that they know how to figure out everything and they know how to put it together. And that's actually kind of a part of kind of a criteria that we can go over later. But that's what makes it really appealing, because then, you know, you've got someone that is willing to completely give more to you than would otherwise be rational or logical. That's like a mandatory element.
So one of the other things that's kind of relevant about the Miquella situation versus, say, Marika is that, like, Marika, even though she's no longer really a present force in the world, she's been sealed inside the Earth Tree for $1,000 years now. There is, like, a political structure built up around her and, like, a military structure built up around her, and she's, like, her authority is sort of absolute. Like, she is the top of, like, a pyramid power structure. Miquella is also someone who's, like, not really present, but it's a lot looser. Like, people are just sort of coming toward Miquella from all over the place. And this ties into something you were talking about with regard to, like, how cults versus religions function, which is totalism versus authority.
The understanding of kind of cults as we know them currently really came about around in, like, the 40s and 50s. Here's what people saw that they were so, like, taken aback by, that was really kind of the, like seeing somebody that was completely indoctrinated, was prisoners of war. And basically people who were kind of forced to confess and turn against their own country. Like, that was really kind of the example that was presented, and they were trying to understand, how did that happen? You know, and they noticed it wasn't done through physical torture. That really wasn't particularly effective. What they noticed was that it was very much a learned helplessness that was kind of created, and also messing with their environment. Whenever you are able to affect someone's sleep, sense of time, that's when you really have them, when you're able to really make somebody malleable.
Right.
You want to isolate a person. Like, you want to keep them away from other people, because you don't want other people to be acting as an influence, because you only want to really kind of overwhelm them with just yours and have them be dependent on that.
Yeah. So we'll use this as, like, a jumping off point to kind of talk about, like, the various Miquella kind of cultist NPCs that you encounter in the DLC.
Okay.
Because something that I found when I first played it, and I went through the Shadow Keep door and the Great Rune broke. And then Ansbach was like, oh, the spell's been lifted. I kind of initially thought of that as a bit of a cheat. Like, what they've done is they've gone, oh, Miquella's just mind-controlling people. So their motives didn't matter. Right. He was just mind-controlling them. What I now appreciate going back to it is that actually they all have, like, reasons to do what they do, and they all respond to the Miquella bewitching / unbewitching in different ways. So the one who's, like, straightforwardly like, oh shit, I was mind controlled, is Ansbach.
Right.
And Ansbach straight up says, like, hey, actually I was fighting with Miquella, and Miquella did his, like, brainwashing move on me where he grabs you and hugs you. And interestingly, Ansbach blames himself for that. He says, like, I was weak. I couldn't stand up to it. You know, I failed Moog. Right. Then you have, like, Freya. Freya is following Miquella because specifically there was a point in Freya's life where she was dying of Scarlet Rot. And Miquella appeared before her and healed her. And because of that, she continues to side with Miquella even when the bewitching is lifted. So it's almost like the bewitching was kind of a formality with her, like she was already ready to follow Miquella. Moore is just lost and wants friends. And when the bewitching is lifted, you can actually tell Moore what to do. Like, he doesn't seem to have, like, a great deal of...
he needs direction.
He needs direction. He's someone who comes across as, like, he attaches himself to, like, groups of people. And he's like, these people like me, I'll be their friend. So when you meet him in the game, he's like, he's friends with the other Miquella people. He's also friends with a bunch of Kindred of Rot. And it's like he doesn't really know how to think independently of, like, having a group around him.
Right.
So he's obviously, like, in a very, very malleable, vulnerable position to, like, Miquella showing up and saying, hey, follow me into the Land of Shadow. Dryleaf Dane is a bit odder because he barely has any dialogue and he's described as, like, a very, like, ascetic, wandering figure.
Yeah, he's already a monk,
Yeah, they specify that, like, he's apparently always wanted Miquella to rise as a god since beforehand. So this, again, seems to be independent of the bewitching. Like, he's just a Miquella follower.
Yeah, this would be somebody that is already kind of looking for that sort of devotion to something, that or a higher purpose of some sort.
So there's 3 more of them who I think are, like, these are to me the 3 most interesting ones, right? So, Tolier. Tolier is interesting because, like, he doesn't actually care about Miquella, he cares about St. Trina.
Yeah.
So his devotion to Miquella is actually the devotion to St. Trina, and when he realizes that Miquella and Trina have separated, he just stays with Trina. And the way that he talks about Trina, it's kind of similar to the way that Freya talks about Miquella, where it's like he had this encounter with St. Trina. It's like he has this ecstatic experience of the true, like, velvety sleep of St. Trina, and he spends the rest of his life chasing it. So it's somewhere between, like, an ecstatic experience and, like, you know, chasing, like, a high that he sort of remembers having.
Tolly reminds me kind of somebody that struggles with addiction.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that's people that are seeking kind of, I mean, I don't want to sound cliche in this, but are seeking sort of an escape.
Yeah.
Or a disconnect of some sort. And I mean, the way that he talks about it, it just sounds very narcotic. Like,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I can't really think of it any other way.
I was watching some of the Robert J. Lifton stuff that you sent me, and one of the things that he talks about is, like, the way that cults would practice chanting and breathing
Mhm.
in a way that specifically starved your brain of oxygen. It puts you in this, like, kind of half awake, half asleep state where you're very, very suggestible.
Yeah, it's hypoxia. I mean, you're not getting enough oxygen to the brain. It makes you lightheaded, and you actually it impairs your cognitive functioning. So, I mean, you're not going to be able to think critically. You're like hardly at all. So that's very intentional.
So then we've got Hornsent.
Mhm.
So even though Hornsent is bewitched, Hornsent has this almost like pragmatic view of Miquella, which is that Miquella is going to kind of depose the authority of the Erd Tree. Since Hornsent is completely obsessed with getting revenge on Marika and Mesmer and deposing them, he's willing to go along with Miquella to achieve that end.
He has very black and white thinking, which is very much like that's something that is very much facilitated in cults. People are they have to conform to the group ideology and to be perfect and to fall within that. And that kind of going along also with what's doctrine over person. That's a little bit more true to, I guess you would say, like maybe America as opposed to Miquella. But Miquella's is a little bit more loose, but it's also able to cater to this more diverse group of people in a way.
And then there's the final one of the troop,
Lita,
who is already a fanatical Miquella worshipper. And what's interesting with her specifically is, like, she realizes that Miquella has been bewitching her and just keeps going along with it.
Right.
Because she just instantly, like, so, well, of course, well, yeah, Miquella's bewitched me, whatever, I'm still on Miquella's side. Like, she essentially is apologizing for his behavior. She's rationalizing it. But what's, like, really interesting about Lita is that when the bewitching wears off, she's like, well, alright, I was bewitched, but I'm still on Miquella's side. And then she gets paranoid that the other members of this little, like, band of people, they might act differently now that the bewitching has worn off, and she gets concerned that, like, they're gonna go rogue. They're gonna betray Miquella.
So that is something that occurs specifically by design in a lot of cults, is for there to be people that are part of it that gain like kind of a certain status or authority kind of alongside like the leader, or is like considered to be kind of like their right hand or what have you. And that's that whenever the cult leader is basically unable to kind of oversee things, they know that they've basically trained certain people to essentially do that for them. There's a lot of like purging and like, it sets you up to be paranoid. Like you feel that you're always being watched and that people are going to find out, and like that's an element of what makes it really hard to be able to get out. You're being watched all the time and people will turn against you. And then there are going to be people that are never going to fall out of that mindset.
The other interesting thing about Leda is that she gets paranoid literally about St. Trina, who is Miquella. So it's like she's so into Miquella that she begins to distrust parts of Miquella that don't align with who Miquella is supposed to be.
Deep down, like you understand that you've been deceived, but you're beyond the point of being able to like face that and kind of accept it. And it kind of reminds me of like people that fall victim to cults, or even are like maybe duped or scammed or what have you. Yeah, it's really difficult for people to when they've been duped and then are seeing kind of like what they've followed and kind of fell for. It's really hard for them to kind of admit that.
Yeah. Yeah, so like of all of the people in the DLC that Miquella has like openly bewitched, kind of the only one that he really needed to seriously do some like thought control to was Ansbach.
Yeah.
Everyone else was like so close to following Miquella or already following Miquella, and he just kind of gave them a tiny little push. And they've all got their own reasons for doing it, whether it's like they had a personal experience or he represents like something politically advantageous for them.
Right, which this brings up a kind of a point in the whole like authoritarianism and totalism, is that whenever you're in like a climate where there's a lot of divide, it's going to be much easier. Because I'm looking at it and I'm kind of like with Ansbach, for example. The thing that's really distinct about him and about his character is that he's the one that has had the most lived experience. And
Yeah, he specifically calls himself out as being old. Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, I would. Now that he said it, so yeah, he's the old one. He's the old fart. He's the one that Saint shit. So yeah, he has that, and that's actually really key to being able to also kind of spot these kinds of things. That's a vulnerability factor in a lot of cases, which is why it's really important to have kind of like a strong support system and you know, being an ally to people and kind of helping them with it.
So that brings us to Miquella himself and kind of what Miquella is offering these people in terms of a worldview.
We'll just think happy thoughts and it will all be okay. Join hands.
Yeah.
Hug and make up. Do it.
Because Miquella being like a child kind of informs his view of the world. Like we were just talking about, Ansbach is the one who's able to like question things because Ansbach is old. Miquella is technically probably older than Ansbach because he's like immortal god baby, but he still has like the mindset of a child when you sort of hear about what he's doing, like, which has like, it's not a case of having like that solely being a negative thing.
Right.
Like the fact that he sees like his sister is suffering from an illness and he just like puts his foot down and goes, no, and throws everything he can into healing her. Like, that's admirable, but it's also indicative of someone who is on a certain level like a little petulant and incapable of accepting that like things sometimes go wrong.
And there's Godwin, to die a true death. And then technically, in the way that he has sort of this admiration for Radon, you know, this is my badass brother, blah, blah, yeah. Like, it's kind of like that. Because even whenever you see the cutscene that's at the end, it's this kid that's like kind of bent down. It's like, promise me. Like, it's very much like, yeah, my brother's gonna come beat you up. Like, it totally has that.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that makes it really difficult. So I'm trying to remember, like, whenever how many people have, you know, drew the conclusions, because of course visually there are definitely ones. Because obviously a Griffith.
Yeah.
I think that possibly there was a sigh of relief when I was like, oh, you know, and I told you, I was like, oh, so Rosine, and you're like, oh, thank God.
So when, like you were saying, so a lot of people were like, oh, yeah, I know what they're going to do with Miquella. They're going to Griffith it. And the thing I kept pointing out about Miquella is like, Miquella's not evil. Miquella's naive. So what they ended up doing is like, it's a partial Griffithing, but it's mostly a Rosining.
Yeah. In Berserk, probably one of the most probably the second most disturbing part for a lot of people is a part that's called the Lost Children arc. it's really short and it's kind of separate from everything else, like insofar as kind of like standing on its own, but it represents something that's really important to the story overall. Basically, Rosine is a child that is a part of this village. She became an apostle after experiencing abuse from her parents, and there were a lot of children that were in this village that were also, had abusive parents as well. And so there were others that kind of followed Rosine's lead to kind of escape that. But because of, you know, becoming apostle being a very malevolent thing, inherently, because of what it's connected to, even though she is still a child, and the way that she is going about it, and not understanding the consequences of things and what they imply. Like, for example, the thing that is so disturbing about specifically within that story is when they are, I guess, playing war and they're just mimicking the adults that they see and killing each other and doing other things with stingers. And it's really disturbing, but they're just like, oh, we're just playing like the adults. It's just play, it's just pretend, and they're so detached from it. Because it hasn't registered with them because it wouldn't at that point. And it's also there was something that I read of somebody kind of referring to it as sort of like also a Peter Pan thing as well.
Yeah.
But yet Miquella doesn't have the ability to understand why, and that's really, I think, what more so what Saint Trina was like operating as, was the insight and wisdom that was there.
Absolutely.
To be able to, understand that this is not how this works. Like, you can't just, you can't just make people like each other and force them and take away their free will. But he doesn't see it that way.
And that's like the whole thing about Trina being this like older, wiser part of himself.
Mm-hmm.
He's like going, no, and he's like, he's literally getting a part of himself he doesn't want to deal with and he's burying it, which is something a lot of people do. And like, I'm on board with it. My only issue is that she stays buried and doesn't actually do anything.
I mean, she is a plant.
I know.
It's really far down there.
Yeah, maybe if they just keep growing upward, just creep out of the hole. Miquella is also called out specifically by Ansbach as, like, the immaturity is the source of the problem.
Oh, he says that?
Well, one of the things Ansbach says is, like, Miquella's taken Moog's corpse.
Oh, yeah, he doesn't understand how he's, like, how...
Yeah, because it's not Miquella stole Moog's corpse. Oh my god, what a horrible thing to do. It's like, Miquella stole Moog's corpse, and I don't think he actually understands what is so messed up about having done that. Ansbach does call Miquella a monster at one point. But, like, he also it's in the context of, like, this kid is really, really frightening. Rather than, he's not a monster like Rykard or Godric. He is just, like, incredibly frightening that he can just, like, steal people's, like, he can just compel people to do things. I think that whole thing really ties into, like, Miquella as an eternal child. He is so powerful that he never actually has to go through any of the things that make you mature. Yeah, because, like, this is all going back to his whole, like, Scarlet Rot Golden Needle thing, where it's like, the Scarlet Rot has completely destroyed an entire continent. It also kind of destroyed, like, a huge part of the Eternal Cities. It's just sunk into this swamp, right? And the Golden Order, which is, like, the principle upon which this whole world is functioning, couldn't stop the Scarlet Rot. And Miquella's first, like, really significant thing he does in the story is he manages to stop the Scarlet Rot. So it's like, he doesn't have to deal with the fact that something he wants to do might not work because it always has worked out because he's so powerful.
Yeah, and just the whole, oh, you can be our friend. That just kind of makes me think of everybody like going to you can come to the holly tree. You can be my friend. I have a tree house. You won't get bullied anymore. And little froggies just never fucking got there. That's sad. They just cartwheeled off into the fucking blood. Like they cartwheeled off into the fucking Cannibal Corpse album.
But I think it's kind of interesting that like they did end up there because the way that you get to Mogwin Palace is that you go in the wrong direction when you're going to the Halig Tree. So like they were following Miquella and they actually found where Miquella was. He's just in Mogwin. So that it actually kind
that's
of
that's when you grow up too fast.
Yeah. Literally, he's huge.
Like, oh, we didn't want to see it like that.
The interesting part to me, like contrasting Miquella with the other like demigods, is that like to me the most interesting contrast there's actually with Melina. You don't think of Melina as a demigod because she's not a boss that you fight. She doesn't have a rune or anything, but like it was like reasonably clear in the base game that she was one of Marika's children. And the DLC like outright confirms it by saying that like Messmer was her older brother. Melina has been through a lot of shit if you accept, even if you don't like follow the whole like Melina's a Glomite Queen thing, like she's still someone who has been like burned up.
Yeah.
Like she's lost her physical body, she's lost most of her memory and her identity, and she's just kind of like stumbling around.
And then she goes and sets herself on fire again. Willingly, eagerly, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
She's been burnt once and be like, yeah, I'll just be burnt again. Like, oof, that's seeing shit and jumping back in it. Yeah.
And like she literally says, like, I've observed the lands between for a very long time. And she reaches the conclusion that like basically things need to start dying.
Yeah.
Marika's made everything go wrong by binding destined death in Farum Azula. But the other thing about Melina is like she's not like murder happy McGee when she's talking about death. Like the fact that she talks about death and that she wants indiscriminate death to come back to the world, that doesn't mean that she's like actually into like murdering people in this kind of nihilistic way.
Right.
Because she gives this speech when you're at the base of where the Frenzied Flame is, where she basically says like the whole world is completely fucked up. Everything's broken and there's no way to fix it. But that doesn't mean that life is meaningless.
Right.
Like, people continue to live and struggle and become and thrive and love each other, even though the world has gone to shit, and that makes the world worth preserving.
Yeah.
Whereas Miquella's approach is to say the world has gone to shit and it's only going to get better if I step in and I fix absolutely everything. And Miquella's weirdly closer to the Frenzied Flame. He's kind of standing aside and going, make everything, like, just flatten everything out again. If you apply Miquella's solution to everything, it undoes what Melina's talking about. Because, like, it's no longer to do with the people, it's no longer to do with what makes you unique as a person that's drawing you toward other things that are unique. It's like, I'm compelling you to all do this. Miquella is, like, removing that agency from things and saying, no, I'm going to make them come together.
He doesn't understand the value in overcome the hardship and the struggle.
Yeah, and that, again, ties it back to this whole idea of, like, the Miquella thing is way more cult-like, because everything's compelled, everything's coerced, there's one totalizing answer to everything.
That's the black and white thinking. I mean, basically, there's no room for there to be anything else outside of it. And the thing is that he's still acting in a very human way. And there's something about there's some probably a few characters that have probably said, these are men that are becoming gods, or like basically the faults of like humans or what have you.
Yeah, they talk about like the the problem with the gods is like it's pettiness that's like basically human levels of pettiness.
Yeah.
They call it the fly in the ointment.
Yeah. That's from
Yeah. Gold Mask.
Yeah. I guess kind of the way that they would be framed in the game, and then also in just other contexts, that something that is a god or of the supernatural being isn't going to be concerned with things that are of that sort. Like they're gonna be beyond that. Just they're over it, right? Whereas it's a very human response and emotion.
Okay, thank you very much, Troubled Maker.
Thank you. Had a good time. We've seen some shit.
I did too. Yeah, we did.
Shit.
We have.
Good too.
And I'll link your channel where you've got a lot of Elden Ring free cam footage you've been doing in the video description if people want to check that out.
Yep. I mean, and one day there might, because I'm just kind of learning how to do all that kind of stuff, and I like to put things together for people or whatever. Just it's something for me to do. But that's probably not what my channel is going to be about whenever and if that happens ever. So yeah, but I do like to tinker. I do make some stuff.
Cool.
Yeah, I do computer.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Beep.